Greetings and welcome to Unit 2, the Texas Constitution and Federalism. So, have you ever read the U.S. Constitution? It's very lengthy, right? And we're going to, in this lecture, we're actually going to look at the current Constitution of Texas. We're going to compare the Texas Constitution to the United States Constitution, and we're going to discuss the concept of federalism and the relationship between the states and the federal government. We have a whole lot of ground to cover. So without any further delay, let's begin. So, key characteristics of our state constitution. Texas has ratified 7 different constitutions for the state, right, throughout our history. The one that we are currently using is the one from 1876. Now, true, the Texas Constitution has been amended over 500 times since its ratification in 1876. Yet, nevertheless, this is the one that we are still using. Another characteristic is we possess one of the longest state constitutions in the United States. Our Constitution is approximately 99,357 words. Now, we do not possess the longest. That actually goes to Alabama. The state of Alabama and their constitution is 345,000 words long. So, good job there, Alabama. We also have dispersed powers in decentralized institutions. Very specifically, so we have dispersed powers, right? We have clear separation of powers, clear checks and balances. We have these sandboxes for which the Texas legislature, the governor, and the judiciary can operate within. And we see this decentralized specifically within the governorship, within the Texas governor, within the executive branch. We see this decentralization. And clear example of that is for our executive branch is fragmented. More on that in a little bit. And we're going to dive way more into that when we get in another lecture. But just note right now, just these broad strokes here, that our institutions, power is dispersed, yes, and that Texas governor specifically is decentralized. Now, I mentioned a moment ago these sandboxes. One of the reasons why our Constitution is so long is because it places rigid limitations on government procedures. And that is to say that these sandboxes that the Texas sandbox, that's an analogy that I like using, or imagery that I like to use to help us understand this, right? That the Constitution establishes these sandboxes, these powers for which they possess, and it's very clear cut that the executive has theirs, the judiciary has their power, and that the legislature has their power, and they're completely separate from one another. Right? It's very rigid in that there's very little freedom or flexibility given to each branch of government here. So one of the prime examples that I like to use is that remember that the legislature is the only branch of government that can pass and make laws, right? They're the only ones that can do this. Now, the governor has the power to veto bills legislation passed by the legislature. True. They can sign it into law. Absolutely. They can call a special session. True. That mandates it says that the Texas legislature has a very specific topic they have to address. But despite the efforts of the governor, ultimately in the end, the Texas legislature has the authority and the power solely to decide what legislation to pass, regardless of what pressure is put onto them from another branch. Right? And the Texas Constitution clearly lays out and establishes these sandboxes. This imagery I like to use to help us understand this. Right? So these are clearly defined, well-established, rigid, no flexibility given to the sandbox, to these sandboxes for which we have. I'm digressing. Let's move on. So Article 1 establishes the Bill of Rights here in Texas. We do have a Bill of Rights built into the Texas Constitution. It's very similar to the United States Bill of Rights. Very similar. These civil liberties are protected in sections 1 through 8. Now, I want to take a moment here. Sometimes I think that civil liberties. Sometimes we think of them as that that the Bill of Rights is this document of rights that the government is granting to us, and that we should just be thankful that the government granted these to us. That's not what this is, right? That's not what this is. Civil liberties, whether in the Bill of Rights, whether we're talking about the U.S. Bill of Rights or the Texas Bill of Rights, the Bill of Rights is a limitation placed on government on what they can and cannot do with you, or what they can do with you and I, right? That's the whole point to a Bill of Rights. It's a limitation on government. Now, that limitation is not so absolute, and here's what I mean. We have absolute free speech, and I will make that assertion, for as long as I live, because we do have free speech. Absolute free speech. But you and I both know that there are certain limitations to that speech. Very specifically, I'm referring to speech. That, that can I yell fire in a crowded theater? Well, no, because if I did, even if there's no fire, I'm creating a dangerous situation where people could lose their lives. Supreme Court has been clear, I don't have that power nor that authority. I have the right to own and bear arms. But we also recognize that there are certain limitations to that civil liberty. For example, can I own a nuclear weapon? Can I own a biological weapon? I think most of us would say no. That's not what that was intended for. Right? So there are certain limitations, right? But in general, these civil liberties, this is establishing what the government cannot do. They cannot infringe it. Okay, and that's what we're talking about here. Even though what we've seen in the past is that while we do have these civil liberties, they can be modified based upon circumstance. Right? Anyways, I'm digressing. Sections 9 through 31 protect rights in criminal proceedings. That is to say that we are innocent until proven guilty. Right? In Article 1 here, make sure that the integrity of the court is protected, that our civil liberties are protected, that we have a right to a speedy and fair trial, and that the Constitution actually does protect, these rights within criminal proceedings. And we find that in Article 1. Marriage Clause, Section 32 of Article 1. Now, very quick and condensed way of amending the Texas Constitution. Remember, I mentioned that we've amended it over 500 times. The amendment process here in Texas, as prescribed by the Constitution of 1879, sorry. What that clearly does, 1876, I said it right. Anyways, what this does, okay, is the Texas legislature agrees to pass an amendment. They find an issue they want to address. They pass an amendment. That amendment gets placed on a ballot for you and I to vote on. And I worked as an election worker when this marriage clause was passed. And overwhelmingly, the majority of Texans agreed that we wanted a ban on same-sex marriages. Well, fast forward a couple of years to the Harberfeld v. Hodgins Supreme Court decision, which struck down state bans of same-sex marriages. So what we've seen now is, while yes, this does exist in the Texas Constitution, Texas can't enforce it because the Supreme Court has said that that's invalid. right? And we're going to talk about a little bit later in this lecture about this natural if I can talk, the national supremacy clause. And what that means is that when we have a discrepancy, when there's a conflict between the two, right? The federal law, the interpretation established by the Supreme Court will supersede state law. This is built into the U.S. Constitution. We'll talk about that here in a bit. Sections 32 through 34 protects public access and use of public beaches, the right to hunt, the right to fish, harvest wildlife, etc. We find all of this laid out in Article 1. Let's move on to Article 2. We see separation of powers here. Right? Remember I mentioned a moment ago these sandboxes, right? Well, these three sandboxes are three branches of government, right? We have the we have the legislative branch, we have the executive branch, and we have the judiciary, right? So we have these three branches of government, and Article 2 clearly lays out this. Power is explicit. Again, one of the reasons why our Constitution is so long is because it is so explicit. It restricts the powers to each branch of government, and it's very clear and very laid out what those powers are. There is no flexibility here because it's so rigid, it's so laid out, it's so detailed, right? Let's move on. So Article 3 of the Texas Constitution establishes the Texas legislature. And we have what's known as a bicameral legislature. That is to say that we have two separate houses, two separate groups within the Texas legislature. We have the Texas House and we have the Texas Senate. Okay, this is our bicameral legislature. Article 3 does establish qualifications for the legislature. It establishes an age limit. It establishes the residency requirement, how long you have to be here in Texas in order to run. We also see it details the election and the term of office and procedures for the Texas legislature. All this is clearly laid out in Article 3. So it establishes how long, how often we elect them. It establishes how long they serve, etc. And again, procedures within the Texas legislature. It also clearly and very explicitly limits the powers of the Texas legislature. That is not to say that the Texas legislature is weak per se. What I'm trying to get at is their hands are tied by the Constitution. They can only do what the Constitution allows them to do. Power is it's not flexible where they can bend outside of it. It's very rigid and very explicit, very detailed on exactly what they can do. And that's the key here. It's very rigid. That's again, going back to this idea, that's one of the reasons why it's so long. Okay? Let's move on. Article 4 establishes the executive branch. We have a plural executive branch. What that means is that power is diffused within the executive branch. So if we were to compare very quickly the U.S. president to the Texas governor, okay, they're both heads, both chiefs of the executive, right? But what we see very clearly is some differences, right? For example, the U.S. president, they get to appoint every position within the executive branch. Every position. Here in Texas, the only one they get to appoint is the Texas state. It's the state Secretary of State. So the Texas Secretary of State. That's the only position they can appoint, unless there's a vacancy. More on that in another lecture. But just note for right now, that's what we're talking about here. So the president gets the veto, the governor gets the veto. The governor also gets the line item veto, which that's the power the president doesn't have. But the fact that the president gets to appoint all the positions and the governor doesn't in the executive branch, this is a clear this is that diffusion that I'm talking about. It's decentralized. Now, and one of the reasons for this goes back to our Texas history. Texans historically do not like power-wielding executives. This all goes back to our experience Texas has had with Santa Anna. Yes, going that way back. So our Constitution ensures that there is not one individual that has absolute power, right? That it is in fact diffused, and so much within the executive branch that the governor is more. It has been said that the governor is more of a spokesperson for the state more than anything, and we'll talk more about that in another lecture. When we get to the governor, when we get to the unit regarding the executive, we're going to talk more in detail about that. But just note, we have a plural executive system, and that is to say that it's diffused, that we independently elect other offices, executive offices. We'll get into that. Now, so the governor is in fact the chief executive among the independently elected executive officers. One of the reasons why our ballots are so long is because we do elect every individual within the executive branch, or the heads within the executive branch. They're elected by you and I. So we're talking about the lieutenant governor, the attorney general, the comptroller of public accounts, the commissioner of general land office, right? All these positions within the executive branch are elected by you and I, which adds to the length of our ballot. The governor, I mentioned this already, the governor appoints the state's Secretary of State. We do have a Texas Secretary of State, and they are in charge, they're the record keeper and the elections administrator, if you will, for the entire state. Right? So that's what we're looking at here. And Article 4 clearly lays out the sandbox for the executive, what they can do. Clearly, explicitly lays that out there. So Article 5 of the Texas Constitution establishes our judiciary, and we have what's known as a bifurcated appellate court system. What that means is that we have two high appellate courts here in Texas. The highest appellate court that you can appeal a criminal case to is the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals. The highest court you can appeal a civil case to is the Texas Supreme Court. So the Texas Supreme Court only hears and only handles civil cases. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals only handles and hears criminal appeals. Okay, so that's what we mean when we say a bifurcated appellate system. Now, don't confuse this with like a bicameral legislature, because the bicameral legislature, right? We have to recognize real quick that the House and the Senate, they have to pass a bill together before it gets sent to the governor. And we don't see that here, right? The Texas Supreme Court does not communicate with it doesn't work with in tandem on its decisions with the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, because they handle different things. Their jurisdictions are different. Right? The Supreme Court only handles civil cases. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals only handles criminal cases. Okay, just to hammer that point. So this fragmented system has overlapping jurisdictions, specifically regarding, if you get a speeding ticket, for example, if you get a speeding ticket here in the Houston area, right? It's possible that ticket's going to be issued by the municipality. It's also possible you're going to get one issued by the county. So we see some overlapping, right? Specifically regarding misdemeanors. We're going to dive way more into this when we get to the lecture about the judiciary. So hang tight, more on that information is coming. But for now, just note that we have some overlapping jurisdictions. And we also elect all of our judges. Another reason why we have such a long ballot. If you voted here in Texas, and I hope you do. We do have long ballots. And one of those reasons is that we elect all of our executive and all of our judiciary. Every judge here in the state of Texas is elected. Every state judge is elected. Even the Texas Supreme Court. The governor does not appoint that. You and I get to vote on that. And so it kind of begs the question, right? What do you think about that? Do you think judges should be appointed, or do you think they should be elected? Let me know what you think about that. Let's move on. Article 6 establishes suffrage, that is voting rights, right? So there are voter qualifications and that municipalities and state. Sorry, let me back up here. So voter qualifications are established for municipalities and state elections, and the Texas Constitution in Article 6 clearly lays this out. Okay, it also lays out that the legislature has the power to authorize absentee voting. The counties get to administer absentee voting is authorized by the Texas legislature. Counties carry that out. Also mandates a ballot for all elections. Every position that's elected, the Texas Constitution mandates that they are on the ballot. Right? And so that's what we're looking at here. And this is all found in Article 6. Article 7 establishes our education system. It mandates that we have an effective free public school system. So it's paid for and by tax dollars, which makes sense, right? I mean, everyone benefits from people being educated, right? But the question becomes, and I'm curious of your thoughts about this, how efficient is our public school system? Are there problems? And what do you think let me know what you think those problems are. And how would you go about fixing them? Right? I mean, it's easy for us to point it out, but what can we do to fix it? Right? Real quick, one of the things about education, specifically referring to public school education, that kind of gets to me, is that we tend to have a priority towards sports. Nothing wrong with sports. If you enjoy sports, awesome. That's great. Good for you. But when we prioritize sports over education, that tells me that we have a priority issue. And I don't know if football is more important than reading. I do not know if it's more important than math. I do not know if it's more important than analytical thinking. In my humble opinion, if you can read, write, and do arithmetic, if you can do those three things, anything is possible. You can do anything in life that you want. And I just don't know, with this, it seems like we have a priority with sports that if that's the case. Anecdotal story with us. I have a colleague who applied to work as a public school teacher. And they were impressed with his qualifications. They were very excited to potentially working with him. But they asked him, what can you coach? Well, he didn't go to school to learn to coach. He went to school to teach. And they turned him down because he couldn't coach. And nothing wrong with coaching, by the way. Let me get to this point real fast. That you would not want me to coach you in any sport. Okay? You don't want that. I am not a sports guy at all whatsoever. If you are, that's great. But for me, I am not. You would not want me to coach you in anything. Okay? In baseball, I I don't even know what an inning is, to be frank with you. I have no idea what that means, and I do not care to know. Right? Would you want me to coach you? The answer is no. Okay, so why would you want someone who doesn't have experience with government, teaching you government or teaching you how to write? You see where I'm going with this? This seems to be a priority. Yeah, I'm digressing. Let's move on. Article 7 also establishes the Permanent University Fund, the PUF, which funds research for institutions like A&M, like the University of Texas, UT. So we can find this in Article 7. We got more ground to cover, so let's keep going. Article 8 establishes the taxation of the state. It prohibits state property tax. This can be found in Section 1E. It prohibits personal income tax. This can be found in Section 24. And it limits and regulates local property tax. So yes, the Constitution places limitations and it regulates local property taxes. Right? So we find how the state tax through Article 8 of the Texas Constitution. Let's move on to Articles 9 through 16. This regulates Article 9 through 16 is all about regulations and procedures, right? So regulation of counties, railroads, municipal governments, private corporations, public land, and land titles. All this can be found in Articles 9 through 16. It also gives us the impeachment process. Yes, here in Texas, we can, in fact, impeach. We do not have what's known as a recall. We don't have that option. But we do have the impeachment option. Right? And this impeachment is clearly laid out in the Texas Constitution. Right? The House will pass a resolution calling for the, laying out the crimes that they have found an elected official have committed. And then it's up to the Texas Senate to basically be the jury and to decide whether or not to remove from office or to acquit. Now, one of the things I like to mention about impeachment proceedings is that it's legal in the context of it's in the Constitution. The Constitution gives us this remedy for elected officials who abuse their power, for example. Okay, but it's not the evidence that they have to find, right, that they have to present, is not beyond a reasonable doubt. This is not criminal. This is not a criminal proceeding. It's just a proceeding to be removed from office, which is a lower standard of burden of proof. Basically, in short, just note what I'm trying to get at here is it's legal because it is a prescribed method, but it's not, going up to a judge and jury and being put in prison. That's not what this is. This is simply just being removed or not. Right? That's what I'm trying to get at. And also, there's Articles 9 through 16 also just has miscellaneous regulations that are clearly laid out in the Texas Constitution. So, a lot of ground here. Article 17, we're coming to the end here of the articles. Article 17 gives us the amendment procedures. How do we amend the Constitution? We've amended it over 500 times here in Texas. Right? So step 1 is that there is a proposal made by the Texas legislature, House or Senate, that requires 2/3 vote from both chambers. Once it's approved by the Texas legislature, it moves on to step 2, which gets added onto the ballot, and then just simple majority vote by the voters by ballot. So step 1, Texas legislature passes a proposal. That proposal gets sent to you and I on the form of a ballot. We get to vote on it. If we pass it, if the majority say yes, it gets added to the Constitution. If the majority of us say no, then it gets dismissed. It doesn't get added. Okay. I've mentioned this already. It's been amended well over 500 times since its adoption in 1876, but only 180 amendments have been defeated by Texas voters. So we do enjoy amending the Constitution. Very few amendments have actually been defeated, but nevertheless, this is the case that we have. Now, let's compare the U.S. Constitution to the Texas Constitution very quickly, right? So, the Texas Constitution establishes a republic. It establishes a Bill of Rights. So, a republic. Going back to this idea real quick, a republic. So, the form of government we have is a republic, right? This is mandated by the state constitution. That we do have representatives in government. That's what we're talking about. Bill of Rights, we've already talked about that. Protection of civil liberties. There are 254 counties under the state's supervision. We have there is a procedure we just spoke about to amend the Texas Constitution, and we have 99,357 ward count. Now let's compare this to the U.S. Constitution. Right? It, again, establishes a republic that we have elected officials that we elect. We have a U.S. Bill of Rights to protect that place limitations on government intrusion on our civil liberties. We have 50 states under the supervision, if you will, of the federal government. It does provide a process to amend the U.S. Constitution. So very similar, right? Our Constitution is very, very similar to the national one. But what we need to keep in mind here is the word count. The U.S. Constitution grants a lot of flexibility to Congress, to the president, versus here in Texas, our legislature and our executive, their hands are tied. And very specifically, they're placed in those sandboxes. And that's the whole point, again, I hear. 4,352 wards grants them a lot of flexibility. And the Constitution grants that flexibility. That's what I'm getting at. Let's move on. So, let's move on now to federalism, right? This idea. So, what is federalism? Federalism, by definition, is an institutional arrangement that creates two relatively autonomous levels of government, each possessing the capacity to act directly on the behalf of the people with the authority granted to it by the national Constitution. So what we see here are two levels of government. Okay, we have the national level and we have the state level. And that each possess the autonomy to pass and create laws, to act on its own behalf. With one careful note here, that as long as it doesn't violate the national Constitution, the U.S. Constitution. So some examples of federalism that we see in the world. The United States, obviously, we adopted federalism. We see federalism in Canada, Germany, and in Mexico. Let's move on. So Article 6 here gives us the supremacy clause. I mentioned this, I believe, a few moments ago. So it declares that the Constitution and federal law are supreme law. Article 6, Section 2 reads, and I quote, "This Constitution and the laws of the United States, which shall be made in pursuance thereof, and all treaties made, or which shall be made under the authority of the United States, shall be the supreme law of the land. And the judges in every state shall be bound thereby in anything in the Constitution or laws of any state to the contrary notwithstanding." In other words, it is built within the U.S. Constitution. When there is a conflict between federal law and state law. Our U.S. Constitution clearly states federal law will supersede state law. Even when it comes down to the Texas Supreme Court ruling one way and the U.S. Supreme Court rules another way, right? What the Supreme Court does supersedes our Supreme Court. This is clearly laid out and clearly established by the U.S. Constitution. This was built in by the framers of the U.S. Constitution to ensure that states didn't go out of hand and violate national law. Right? Also, we see this preemption doctrine, that is federal law that preempts state law, even when those laws that conflict. Right? There is intent is not to subordinate the states to the federal government, but to affirm that one body of law binds the country. So we don't want mass confusion here, right? We don't want to see a situation where laws are adopted by various states, that various laws are passed by these states, that there's no sense of uniform, right? State laws do vary, absolutely, and we've seen with political culture some of that impact it can have. And so we do have regional differences, but the intent here is to ensure that there is one clearly established law and that there is not a violation of that. That's what we see here. We also see that enforcement is complex. Look no further than marijuana. Right? According to the federal government, marijuana is an illegal substance. Yet we see states like California, Colorado, there's another one. Anyways, even here in Texas, we are starting to decriminalize it. The point here that I'm trying to make is simply this, that this is complex. Even though the federal government deems it as an illegal substance, what some states have chosen is to decriminalize it. But Professor, that's a violation. We see a conflict here. You're right. But what's happened, these particular states are refusing to prosecute these types of cases. And that's what we're seeing. We're running out of time, so let's get on. So, some characteristics, right, of federalism. State powers are not listed in the Constitution, right? States have autonomy. We just established that with our definition. They do have autonomy, but their powers are not necessarily clearly established by the Constitution. Speaking of the Constitution, within the Bill of Rights, the 10th Amendment, it says that, it reads, and I quote here, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states or to the people. In other words, what's not explicitly stated in the Constitution, that's given to states to decide. Okay, so what's not explicitly federal law, what's not explicitly in the Constitution, that is given to the states to decide. Okay, that's what we see here. We see the importance, the importance of the 10th Amendment. This gives states the power. This gives them power. This allows the states to have the autonomy, because the Constitution, through the 10th Amendment, clearly states if it's not forbidden by the Constitution or by federal law, states have at it. So that's what we see here. And there are 5 structural characteristics to federalism. Right? First, we've already talked about 2 levels of government. We have these 2 layers. Right? National constitution cannot be changed without the consent of the sub-national governments, i.e. states. Separation of powers within each level of government, we see that. We have to have that. National courts resolve disputes between and within government. And lastly, Subnational governments, i.e. state governments, are represented in the national legislature. These are the 5 structural characteristics of federalism. Okay? And that concludes our lecture here for today. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to me. Until next time, have a good one.